Welcome to Victory Baptist Church. Today's message is from November 7th, 2021. It was delivered by Nate Herman. So join us as we continue our series through the book of Luke.
All right, well, we are, this morning, going to be finishing up in chapter 6 of Luke. We've been there for several weeks now, and I think actually this will be actually not just finishing chapter 6, but also Jesus will wrap up the Sermon on the Plain, which we've been in for the last several weeks. And it was actually a month ago when I taught that we were introduced to this Sermon on the Plain in verses 17 through 19 of chapter 6. And so here I am 5 weeks later, and I get to close it out. So, if you remember, just a little bit of review to kind of set the stage for where we're at today. If you remember beginning when I taught a month ago, the Sermon on the Plain, Jesus had just selected his 12 capital A apostles, as Josh had identified them. And he had came down to this level place where a multitude of people had met him. Remember, these were people from all over Israel, all the way down in the Judah area of Judah and Jerusalem. And then also people from the pagan region of Tyre and Sidon had traveled dozens of miles to come and see and hear this Jesus who word had been spreading about, okay? So we followed along with this sermon, Jesus' Sermon on the Plain, over the previous weeks, and we've seen Jesus teach some really revolutionary and difficult things, right? Things at the time that were very contrary to the prevailing ideas and traditions concerning God and the law. Things that were hard to understand, especially for that audience. So here are some of these things, these phrases that we have seen Jesus teach over the last few weeks. So, blessed are the poor, the hungry, and those who weep. Woe to the rich, to the satisfied, to those who laugh. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. As you wish others would do to you, do so to them. Each tree is known by its own fruit. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. These are just kind of some snippets and paraphrases of some of those lessons that we've gone through in the last weeks, and that Jesus has brought before us in this sermon. So these are principles that, if we've grown up or attended a Bible-believing church for any length of time, some of these principles probably aren't totally foreign to us, although they still contradict our very basic inclinations and sinful nature. But if you imagine the average listener who was present that day for the Sermon on the Plain, and think about the fact that they didn't have the benefit of a couple thousand years of Christian history, especially in a Western culture like ours, Jesus' words would have been that much more strange and probably that much harder to really wrap your mind around, and let alone try to live, okay? So for the Jew, accustomed to the rigid tradition and the structure of the Mosaic covenant, it was kind of alarming to hear Jesus' message through this sermon was that really the law is not enough. Even if one could live to the letter of the law, the sinful desires of the heart of a man or a woman betrays what a man or woman truly is. That's why Jesus constantly was rebuking the Pharisees throughout the Gospels, right? If you remember, the Pharisees were supposed to be the best representation among the children of Israel of a holiness and righteous life. And yet Jesus described them, he obviously rebuked them oftentimes. He called them hypocrites. He referred to them as whitewashed tombs because really they spent their energies on the appearance of holiness while within reeked of death and decay and corruption. So according to Jesus, it is not just what we do, but our actions in conjunction with our motives and the intents of our heart that make a person righteous. So last week, Josh taught about the parable of the good tree and the bad tree, right? About how the good tree bears good fruit, the bad tree bears bad fruit, and each tree is known by its fruit. And remember, he taught about that tree, or he mentioned this tree that has the fruit that looks like little Granny Smith apples, but is deathly poisonous. What was that tree called? Manzanillo. I don't remember the name of the tree, but I remember Manzanilla de la Muerte, which is the fruit, the name of the fruit, which is the little apple of death. right? So that stuck with me, but Manchineal was gone. But anyway, looks can be deceiving, right? That was the point. So have you ever picked an apple to eat based on appearance, right? You find this apple out of a bin. It looks perfect, right? Perfect in shape, plump, juicy looking, totally round, not a blemish on the skin. It's got that just vibrant color and it even shines. It's got that polish to it as the light hits it. And you're thinking, man, this is going to be a good apple. I mean, your mouth is watering as you go to take a bite of this thing. Then you get a bite of it, and it literally is like mush. Okay, the meat of the apple is mushy and mealy, and it literally like crumbles and falls apart in your mouth. It's not sweet at all. It might even be a little bitter. It's like, what a disappointment is that? I've experienced that, and I hope hopefully you have too. But you see, as with us, it isn't merely the appearance of the fruit that determines the goodness, but it is what is within. And that's one of the points that Jesus was harping on throughout this sermon. And it's why he found the Pharisees to be a bunch of bad apples as well. So, that was a dad joke, in case you didn't get that. So from here, this is kind of what brings us up to where we're at. Jesus is going to teach this final parable, which really closes up the Sermon on the Plain and closes up chapter 6 for us as well. And in it, he poses a very challenging question to the audience, right? He's taught all these, through parables and teachings, all these phrases that I've just gone through, these really challenging and revolutionary ideas about what it means to be a follower of God and a follower of Jesus and where our hearts should be, let alone our actions. And so after going through all of these tough lessons, and I think David put it, upside down theology compared to what the world and what even the nation of Israel had thought about God up to that point, he poses like a real challenging question. And so we're going to just jump into the text and read it. So we're in Luke chapter 6, verses 46 through 49 this morning. If you want to read along with me, it's up on the overhead as well. Jesus says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I tell you? Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and does them, I will show you what he is like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when a flood arose, the stream broke against that house and could not shake it, because it had been well built. But the one who hears and does not do them is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the stream broke against it, immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great." I also want to read the parallel passage in Matthew. So I don't have it up on the overhead, but it's in Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 through 27. If you have your Bible, you're welcome to turn there with me. If not, just listen along and I'll read that as well. So this is the parallel passage in Matthew from the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 21 through 27. "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.' Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it." So obviously we can see some similarities between these two passages. There's also some differences. And I just want to take a quick minute to remind us about the Sermon on the Plain versus the Sermon on the Mount. There's an argument among people who argue about these things about whether this was the same sermon recorded in Matthew and Luke, or if they were two different sermons. And to me, just on the surface, it looks like they were two different sermons just based on the description of the location. And we kind of went through that the last time I taught, and I think some of the other teachers the last few weeks have touched on that. Regardless, though, even if you don't buy that and you think, well, why is it different if it's the same sermon? Really, the application of the passage is still intact. Matthew's account or version of this parable, though it probably has more detail in it, really the application is the same. The Lord, Lord statement is more in depth. In Luke, we just see a basic question, right? where Jesus says, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you? And then he goes right into the parable. Whereas in Matthew, we see a little bit more of an expansion on that idea. Not a question, but he just simply says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, we did not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name. Did we not, prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. So that's expanded a little bit, but it doesn't really change the meaning of the passage. We get a little bit, as we'll see later, maybe more of a glimpse as to what specifically the interpretation should be is regarding what the rest of the parable means and stuff. I mean, it looks like to here he's talking about literally entering the kingdom of God, which would speak of our salvation, right? So we'll keep that in mind as we move forward in Luke as well. Also, I want to note that Matthew's account differentiates the two men, not just based on what they do, but he describes one as the wise man and one as the foolish man. And so just for an easy way of identifying these two different characters, moving forward, I'm going to adopt that, even though we're teaching through Luke today, just to make that clear. You're going to hear me say wise man and foolish man, and I know that's not what Luke says, but I'm going to use that designation just because it makes it clear to differentiate between the two. What else? Also, in Matthew's version, the flood is actually accompanied kind of by a storm. So we see wind and rain as well, and that shouldn't really that doesn't really change the meaning of the parable or the application. Oftentimes, a flood is actually caused by a storm, right? So there's not a lot of big differences here, really at all. So just want to point that out. Two different accounts, probably of different events, in my opinion. Even if they are of the same event, we got two different guys describing Jesus' sermon. So obviously, we've been through this before. Anytime you ask two different people to describe the same event, there's going to be differences. So just let your mind rest at ease here, okay, when you see these differences. And take a second to look at it, and we can see that the message doesn't change, and there's explanations for it. So from there, we'll leave behind Matthew for the most part. I might refer back to it once or twice, but we're going to continue on in Luke. So I think it's an interesting appeal that Jesus makes here to close this sermon, right? He's taught through all these different parables and lessons of all these kind of really challenging and hard to understand principles. And he ends it with this question. He's going to speak this parable, but he kind of breaks up the flow of his sermon, if you will, and poses this question after he's taught all these things. Here, this multitude of people is here listening to his teaching, and he says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I tell you?" So, for clarification, the word Lord here used is the Greek word kurios, which can carry kind of a broad meaning. It's used several times in the New Testament, and it's what Jesus or disciples called him often, referred to him as Lord, the same word. We see it all the time. In the Koine Greek, though, it kind of has a broad range of meaning. It can mean anything from like a supreme authority, government ruler type of a situation, supreme authority like the Messiah, Jesus Christ himself. It could mean the way a slave would refer to his master, that word Lord. It could also mean it's a respectful term for a teacher or a rabbi as well. So we kind of see this kind of broad spectrum of what that term meant in the original language. In all cases, however, it is a title which carries honor and respect and reverence. So, with that in mind, in essence, what Jesus is asking here with this question, he says, why do you elevate me to this place of honor and yet not honor my words? And so let's consider the audience again in light of that, okay? Why do you elevate me to this place of honor and yet do not honor my teachings? We talk about this multitude of people, and there's kind of three general categories of people that are there. We know that he selected his 12 capital A apostles, right? The disciples that were going to be closest to him, that he was going to pour the most into and train before he came down to this level place. So we got the 12 apostles. We also know that there was a bunch more disciples there. There was a bigger group than the 12 that was following Jesus around and even participating in his ministry. So there's a bigger group of disciples there as well. And then there's kind of the general population of all these people that traveled from all over, Tyre, Sidon to the north, Judea, Jerusalem in the south, and all over in the regions between, that have gathered today to see and hear Jesus. Now remember, and amidst that general population, there's a mix of Jews and Gentiles as well, and probably Samaritans too. So we got a kind of a broad group here. Some of these people are already following Jesus and proclaiming to follow Jesus and his teaching. Some of these people may be being introduced to Jesus for the first time. Some of these people have heard about Jesus, maybe even seen him before, but haven't made any commitment to his movement or his ministry yet. So we got people kind of on the full gamut of the spectrum as far as their relationship to Jesus and their familiarity with him. So I'm sure this crowd we saw at the very beginning, right before he actually starts the sermon, where he had healed, done all these miraculous healings, cast out unclean spirits, and done these amazing signs and wonders, and then he rolls into his sermon. So these people had seen all these amazing things done by Jesus, done with authority that probably they've never seen anyone else obtain or act with. And then he teaches this sermon that is really challenging, really engaging, thought-provoking, with authority that no one else appeared to have. And so I'm sure, at least after this day, there was many in the crowd that would probably refer to Jesus as Lord. But the question is, how many of those people were actually willing to follow Jesus and live out the things he was saying? And I think that's what the question is driving at. Were these people simply going to acknowledge, hey, there's something going on here with this guy. There's something about this guy. He's special. He's not just another religious leader out there, another Pharisee or anything like that. There's something to this guy. The things that I've seen today and the things that he taught attest to that. But what am I going to do about it? That's the question that Jesus poses to these individuals. It forces them to really consider who Jesus is and then think about what their response is going to be. So, were these people going to go back to living their life as they had before, or was this event and this teaching, this sermon that they had witnessed and been a part of this day, were they going to allow it to change their lives, and were they going to become followers of Jesus? And I like that Jesus doesn't just leave the question hanging out there and then dismiss everyone, right? He goes on, he teaches this parable that we're going to jump into now, and he kind of expounds a little bit, and he provides some guidance and even a little bit of a warning to all of us. So, moving on to the rest of the parable, the passage, he says, everyone who comes to me and hears my words and does them, I will show you what he is like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when a flood arose, the stream broke against that house and could not shake it because it had been well built. But the one who hears and does not do them is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the stream broke against it, immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. So we see immediately this contrast between two men, right? The man who does what Jesus teaches and the man who does not. Now notice the flood comes to both men, but the contrast lies in their response to Jesus and the resulting impact of the flood on their house. So first, I want to take a step back. Let's consider what the flood could be, okay? I'm going to present three different ideas of what the flood might represent, things that I came across and that could be possible. First of all, the flood, at least in my mind, invokes the idea of judgment, okay? If I say to you just the simple phrase, flood in the Bible, what comes to your mind? Somebody can say it out loud, I don't care. Noah. I heard the right one. Okay, I heard a lot of stuff there. A little concerning. But no, Noah. Noah. Okay, the story of Noah, which was, right, we review that story. We all know that story. God's judgment on the world for really the sin and corruption that was taking place, right, through the flood. Noah, who knew God, listened to God, obeyed God's word, was prepared and delivered from the flood because of his obedience to God's word, and survived that judgment. So, yeah, by listening and obeying God's word, Noah builds the ark, and he and his family are delivered from God's judgment. while the rest of humanity who did not listen, let alone obey God's word, we know what happened to them. They perished in the judgment. So I do want to recognize we got to be careful with drawing parallels in the Bible. It's really easy to get carried away and try to find all these comparisons and read a lot into the text that might not be there. So, I mean, I think this fits, but I also want to let's lay aside the story of Noah for a second and the parallels there with this parable, and just think about what Jesus accomplished on the cross, right? And what that means for us. He took on our sin and received our judgment and well-deserved punishment for those of us who not just call him Lord, but those of us who follow him and live by his word and are obedient to his word. And through that exchange, we get to experience deliverance from God's judgment, okay? So that seems to fit with this parable, all right? The application seems to be good there. And if we point back to Matthew, again, which might be a different teaching, but specifically when Matthew, the very first part of Jesus telling this parable says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. So in Matthew, it's a little clearer here that this is talking about entrance into the kingdom of heaven. And these are people who thought that their name was in the book based on maybe some of the things they'd done in their life. But apparently, even though they'd done some mighty works for God, they were not fully obedient to God's word and to the words of Jesus. And so they're left on the outside looking in. Okay, so that seems to fit with this first interpretation or application of judgment being the flood, okay? Another one I ran across, which at first I really liked, and then the more as I thought about it and studied it out, I think it's the least likely of what Jesus really meant in terms of what he had in mind when he was actually teaching this, but I think the application is still there, and that's the persecution of the church. If you think about, okay, where we're at, he's primarily speaking to the disciples, and it seems like that in a lot of these big sermons. At the very beginning of the passage in Luke chapter 6, it says Jesus looked up to his disciples, then he started teaching the sermon. So a lot of times it kind of seems like, or we get the impression that he's really teaching the disciples, and the multitude is there, and they're listening, and they get to kind of be there and get to listen to the teaching as well. But really a lot of what Jesus is teaching is really specifically for his disciples. And it's really in the chapters following this that Jesus really starts to allude to the cross, his death and resurrection. And he starts to kind of warn the disciples, kind of in really ambiguous ways at first, but more and more as the story goes on and we head towards the cross, about the persecution and the types of judgments that they're going to face for their association with him. And so with that, bearing that in mind, and the fact that he's teaching this parable to the disciples, it could be that this flood represents the coming persecution of the church and of followers of Jesus, right? And so this would be relevant to anyone who decided to follow Jesus. And so it would speak of to warning them about what is really needed to faithfully come through the persecution they will endure because of their association with Christ and to have their faith intact. We already know one of the 12 is going to betray Jesus despite his outward devotion to Christ, right? Speaking of Judas. And so, unfortunately, in the early church, persecution was the norm, something that, at least in our society, we have no concept other than what we've read through Fox's Book of Martyrs and the early church, the New Testament. But that was the norm. I mean, you truly had to count the cost if you were going to follow Jesus in the early church. Because, I mean, really, you were laying your life on the line to associate yourself with Christ. And so, this parable could have been directly addressing that reality of persecution of the church. Okay, I think the application fits. I don't think it's heresy to say that. I'm not sure if that's really what Jesus had in mind when he was speaking this parable and teaching it. The third one that I'm going to talk about is just really the flood representing the general pain and suffering that we face as just humanity in this world. And I think that might be the one I ended up settling on as maybe the most likely. Certainly the judgment the beautiful thing about a lot of God's word is that it has multiple applications, right? So the judgment thing obviously fits very well. Speaking in light of what he's just, if you look at the context of what he's just taught through, all these challenging things, really what he's talking about is practical, what the Christian life looks like, or the follower of Jesus looks like as far as what they're doing and their thoughts and attitudes. And so it could very well be that the flood represents the general trials and suffering and hardships that we face, all of us face in life, right? If we're not following Christ correctly, if we are not obeying his word, it's easily to be distracted and led astray by the troubles of life, right? Doubt and bitterness can creep in if we don't have our focus on the Lord, and we may begin to question God and his plan for our life or his plan for humanity. And before you know it, we find ourselves drifting farther and farther from God and having less and less trust in who he is, and our faith crumbles underneath that flood of the cares of the world. So as far as what Jesus was specifically speaking to when he taught this parable, I think it's possible that any of these interpretations could have been the thrust of his parable, but most likely either the judgment or the cares of this world, the struggles and cares of the world, representing the flood, right? So flood, persecution, or the general trials of life. I think the application is there for all of them, right? And I think that's the important thing to take. And one more thing I want to note on the flood, and I kind of mentioned it before. So specifically looking at the judgment of God or the struggles and the hardships that we face in life, it's important to note that both of these men had to endure the flood, right? When it comes to the difficulties of life, followers of Jesus are not spared, okay? When it comes to God's judgment, we are not spared. We just have an advocate in Jesus Christ who takes our place in that judgment, right? The judgment of God still has to be exacted, but thankfully Jesus stepped in our place, okay? There are circles within Christianity out there who teach that if you're dealing with financial trouble, physical, sickness and weakness in your body, relationship trouble, that really it points to your lack of faith. And that God really wants to bless you and give you your best life now, to quote some of those people. And that if you're not experiencing those things, it's because you don't have faith, the right amount of faith. And I want to warn all of us against that type of a doctrine. And even just the subtle idea and mentality that we can get. I know I had it when I became a Christian and really struggled with it for years. It's not like I thought that God was a genie in a bottle that wanted to grant me every one of my wishes and whims. But I did kind of have this sense that, like, well, shouldn't I be happier now that Jesus is my Lord and Savior? Why am I still struggling with some of these things? Like, why do I still struggle with disappointment and even depression at times, and struggle with sins that I thought I should have conquered and stuff like that? The reality is, and what God's word says, is that we are not, when we come to Christ, we are not spared the general suffering and struggles and hardships of life. And in fact, when we come to Christ, it may even get harder because of our association with Christ. That's the reality of what Scripture says. God is always more concerned about our spiritual and eternal condition than he is our temporal and physical condition, okay? Sometimes God chooses to grant us victory over our circumstances, and that can be an amazing thing. People are miraculously healed. I totally believe that happens today. And people, miracles happen that deliver people out of really hard situations, whether it could be, a marriage relationship that's broken, or other things like that. I believe that happens, and God chooses to step in sometime and work that way. But I think his pattern more likely is to grant us victory through our circumstances and not over our circumstances necessarily. Noah still had to experience the flood, but because of his relationship and obedience towards God, God was able to grow and prepare Noah so that he could endure the flood. So both houses in the parable were subjected to the flood, but one crumbled and was swept away, while the other held firm and withstood through the flood because of the foundation that had been laid. Okay, moving on. So now that we have an idea of what the flood might represent, let's take a closer look at the example we should follow from the parable. Okay? I hope that all of us would like to have the house with the firm foundation that withstood the flood, right? If you, for some reason, would choose the house built without a foundation that was swept away, I don't know what that says about you. But I'm going to ask you to talk to Josh after church, and he'll set you straight. It just seems like of course you're going to choose the house that wouldn't be swept away by the flood, right? So Jesus specifically points out three things that this man does, identifies three things that the wise man does that prepares him for this flood, okay? First, he comes to Jesus. Second, he hears Jesus' words. And third, he does what Jesus says. So first, we come to Jesus. Does that sound familiar? If you guys listened to my first message a month ago, that was a huge teaching point in that sermon, or in that, my sermon. Come to Jesus, right? And that's a message that goes out to unbelievers and believers alike. How can we hope to follow Jesus' word if we do not hear? And how can we hope to hear if we do not first come? So let's use the example of Noah we talked about again a few minutes ago. Noah was only able to obey God's commands because he was in a place to hear God's commands, right? That makes sense. He was only in a position to hear from God because he had come to God. And this wasn't just a one-time thing. Genesis 6:9 says about Noah, Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Walking with God implies this relationship, a continual and repeated coming together. So here's a statement from my last sermon that I think applies just as directly today. Our need to come to Jesus does not diminish once he becomes our Lord and Savior. And in fact, that need only intensifies. Before we can follow, we must first come, and in order to follow, we must continue to come. Like Noah, in order to be in a position to hear and understand Jesus' words, we must come to Jesus. And again, this need to come, it's imperative both to the believer, maybe a new believer, a believer who's walked with the Lord for decades, or an unbeliever alike. The unbeliever needs to come to Jesus for salvation, and the believer, we have to continue to come to Jesus for our sanctification. And remember, we've talked about that in the weeks previous too, the difference between our salvation and sanctification. Sanctification is that process by which we are being made perfect. It's our growth in our relationship with Jesus. It's tangibly, we can hopefully look back at our life as a Christian and see where we were when we started out and see that God has molded us and shaped us and grown us to where we are today. We're still not perfect. We still sin, obviously. We will not be perfected until we're glorified. But it should be a process as we move through life and as we're constantly coming back to Jesus every day, constantly learning and obeying his word, we should see progress, right? And that's what that sanctification walk looks like. Okay. So, the wise man, he comes to Jesus first, then he hears Jesus. He hears the words of Jesus. After we come to Jesus, we receive his instruction by hearing his word. For the unbeliever, Jesus' word in the gospel instructs us unto salvation, and for the believer, it instructs us into sanctification, which we just talked about, growth in the knowledge and imitation of Jesus Christ. No matter how long we follow Jesus, our need for his instruction is always there, right? And I think that that's something that's really easy for us as Christians to forget. I know when I first was a brand new Christian, man, I just had a voracious appetite for God's word because it was so new and fresh and really revolutionary, like these words of Jesus' sermon were to these people in the audience. It was like groundbreaking because it was totally contrary to the way I'd thought about myself and my role in this world up until that point. And so it's really easy to be enamored with the word at first and to make strides and efforts to change your life at first, but then as time goes on, we kind of tend to grow numb to it, especially if we're not coming to Jesus daily. And we tend to, maybe we even continue to read the word, but maybe we tend to not put as much emphasis on living the word. And that's the danger here, right? We need to firstly hear his instruction, right? No matter how long we follow Jesus, we need his instruction always. We need his word to be saved, and we need it to follow him and continue on that sanctification path, okay? And it's important to note here, if we think again about the crowd, the multitude in front of Jesus, everyone in the crowd has fulfilled these first 2 points of what the wise man has done. They have come to Jesus, At least on this day, they were there. They came to see and hear Jesus, and they were hearing his words. They'd heard him preach this crazy sermon that, challenged their own thoughts and ideas about their own life and their ideas of God. It's the next and final point that really separates the wise man from the foolish man, okay? And that is, Jesus says, the person who, I lost my notes. It's right up there. That's the second part. Everyone who comes to me, comes to Jesus, hears my words, and does them. It's such like just two words, does them. Does the words. It's easy to breeze over that. But that's the difference between the wise man and the foolish man. The one who does Jesus' words and the one who doesn't. The Epistle of James has something to say about being doers of the word in James 1:22 through 25. But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. I like what William MacDonald has to say about this passage in James from his Believer's Bible Commentary. He says, "It is not enough to receive the implanted word. We must obey it. There is no virtue in possessing the Bible or even in reading it as literature. There must be a deep desire to hear God speaking to us and an unquestioning willingness to do whatever he says. We must translate the Bible into action. To go on gaining an intellectual knowledge of the Bible without obeying it can be a trap instead of a blessing. If we continually learn what we ought to do but do not do it, we become depressed, frustrated, and callous." Also, from that passage, it's important to note, if we hear God's word and do not do it, we deceive ourselves. We actually are deceiving ourselves. We feel this familiarity with God because we are reading his word, but if we're not doing it, there is no familiarity there. There's no relationship there. It's like just because you sleep next to your wife every night, you think your relationship is good, and then you go off to work. If you're not talking and interacting with your wife, there is no relationship there. Your marriage is not good if that's all you're doing. But just because there's a closeness in location, that doesn't mean that your relationship is thriving. That's kind of the gist of this a little bit here. 2 Timothy 3:16 through 17 says, "All scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work." So to hear Jesus' word and not to obey is actually to profane the gift of his instruction. It is through obedience that we follow our Lord and build a firm foundation that cannot be shaken. Obedience is the difference between the man whose house withstands the flood and the man whose house is swept away. Okay, quick review. Man, 30 minutes, all right. Jesus brings his sermon to a close by posing this question of obedience to the crowd, right? He forces them to look and consider what they had witnessed that day, consider who Jesus is, and consider how that they were going to respond to his signs and the words that he had preached that day. And the same question is posed to us this morning, right? What are we going to do with Jesus' words? We have them. By the grace of God, we have his word right here. It's available to us every day. We don't have to travel dozens of miles, as this audience did, to hear Jesus' sermon. We have them recorded for us right here. What are we going to do with them? Are we just going to read them, or are we going to go out and live them? He tells a parable to show the benefit of coming to Jesus, hearing his words and doing them. Whether the flood in the parable represents the judgment of God, the persecution of the church, or the trials and suffering of life, the lesson is the same. The man who does these things is like a man who built a house with deep foundations, and when the flood came, the house was able to withstand. And the man who does not do Jesus' words is like a man who builds his house with no foundation, and his house is swept away. Let us be people who dig deep and lay our foundation on the rock. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. This podcast is a ministry of Victory Baptist Church in Hermiston, Oregon. We can be found at 193 East Main Street, or you can also look us up at www.yourvictory.org.